The film industry has been remembering the Jurassic Park star Sam Neill, who has died unexpectedly at the age of 78. Richard E. Grant called him an officer and a gentleman in the truest sense.
Some performers slip into our lives so gently that we forget they were ever strangers. Sam Neill was one of them. He gave a generation its first real scare in a park full of resurrected dinosaurs, and somewhere along the way, without any of us quite noticing, he stopped being just an actor on a screen and became something closer to a familiar voice, the kind you trust the moment you hear it. So when the news broke that the man who once calmly explained why dinosaurs and humans should never share the same island was gone, it landed with a strange, disorienting weight. He was 78. He had, by every account, just won the fight of his life. And then he was simply not there anymore. And the world was left trying to make sense of an ending that arrived with almost no warning at all. The news arrived the way so much heartbreak does now, quietly, through a phone screen, on a Monday that started like any other. It was the 13th of July, 2026, and a short statement appeared on the actor's own Instagram account, the very account he had spent years filling with photographs of his farm animals, his vineyards, and his wine. This time there was no joke attached, no caption about a duck or a chicken. The words came from his family, describing the moment as one of immense sadness, and explaining that they were sharing news of his passing in Sydney, Australia. He had died, they said, surrounded by family, with the same quiet dignity that had defined the whole of his life. Then came the detail that made the entire story feel impossible to process. His death, the family wrote, had been sudden and completely unexpected. They thanked the staff at a private hospital in Sydney for the care they had given him in his final hours, and they asked, gently, for privacy, while they processed a loss that no amount of public affection could soften. Buried inside that same short statement was a detail that made everything harder to accept. Sam Neill had died cancer-free. He had not lost the long, brutal war that so many had feared would eventually catch up to him. He had won it. Days later, his longtime representative stepped forward to clarify what had actually happened, explaining that the cause of death was pneumonia, and that he wanted to correct rumors that had begun circulating online in the vacuum left by the family's brief initial statement. It was not the disease he had spent years battling that finally caught him. It was something else entirely, something sudden, something almost cruelly ordinary compared to the medical war he had just survived. There is a particular kind of grief reserved for endings like this, ones that arrive not as the final act of a long illness, but as an unrelated, almost arbitrary interruption to a life that had just been given back to itself. Looking back at his final weeks, that suddenness feels even more staggering, because there was nothing in his public life that hinted at an ending. In mid-June, he had appeared at a New Zealand Music Award ceremony, photographed laughing alongside singers he admired, and standing beside a former prime minister he considered a friend. That same day, he had posted a short video from his farm, gathering the season's olive harvest, mentioning almost offhandedly that the crop seemed unusually small that year, and that he was not entirely sure why. A little over a week later, he shared the news that he had been nominated for a television award for a drama series he had recently filmed, thanking the cast and crew with obvious warmth and a note of real pride. The ceremony was scheduled for August. He never made it there. A man who was still posting about awards, still tending his farm, still showing up at public events full of energy and mischief, was gone within weeks. To understand how something so sudden could follow something that looked so much like recovery, you have to go back to the diagnosis that first threatened to take him, years earlier, and trace the long, uneven road that followed it. The first sign of trouble showed up in the least dramatic way imaginable. Back in 2022, while he was doing publicity for the latest Jurassic World film, he noticed swelling in the glands of his neck, the kind of small physical oddity most people would brush off after a long stretch of travel and press appearances. The diagnosis that followed was serious. Stage 3 angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma, an aggressive and relatively rare form of blood cancer, the kind most people only ever hear about when it happens to someone they love. He would later describe the experience with the same dry, understated humor that colored most of his public life, joking about how quickly chemotherapy stripped away his hair, and how strange it felt to lose control of his own body after decades of controlling every gesture and expression on camera for a living. The first course of treatment was not enough. His medical team moved him onto a newer, far more expensive therapy, and in a detail he later shared publicly with startling candor, the arrangement with the drug's manufacturer was tied to whether he was still alive 4 months later, a financial condition that turned his own survival into something almost contractual. It is the kind of clinical, almost bureaucratic detail that somehow makes the human stakes feel even sharper than any dramatic monologue could. While his body was under siege, he did something that likely saved more than just his physical health. He began writing, not because he set out to produce a book, but because he could no longer work, and he needed something to get him out of bed in the mornings, when the temptation to simply stay under the covers must have been overwhelming. He later admitted he would lie awake at night rehearsing the words he wanted to put down the following day, and that the process gave shape to days that otherwise had none. That writing became his memoir, published while he was still deep in treatment, closing with words that read very differently now than they did at the time. Words about being a man with every intention of continuing to live, and living, and living. But the disease was not finished with him. The treatment that had been holding it back eventually lost its grip, and he was honest, almost startlingly so, about how frightening that moment was. He said plainly that the chemotherapy had failed, that he felt lost, and that for a while it genuinely looked like the end was closing in faster than anyone around him wanted to admit. His last real option was a clinical trial in Australia for CAR T-cell therapy, an experimental approach that reprograms a patient's own immune cells so they can recognize and hunt down cancer from within the body, essentially turning a person's own biology into the weapon against the disease trying to kill them. It worked. In April of 2026, he announced to the public that a new scan had come back completely clear, calling the result extraordinary, a word he did not use lightly. He had always insisted he was not afraid of dying, only that dying would be an inconvenience, because there was still so much left he wanted to do, so many vines still to prune, so many arguments still to win. For a few months that spring, it looked like he had bought himself exactly the time he needed, and that the worst chapter of his life had finally, definitively closed. What most people did not fully appreciate was how deliberately he chose to spend that time, and how little of it he spent resting, rather than retreating quietly into recovery, the way most men his age recovering from a life-threatening illness might reasonably choose to do. Sam Neill threw whatever strength he had left into defending the land his family had called home for generations. An Australian mining company had proposed a massive gold mining project in the Dunstan Mountains of central Otago, not far from the towns where he had grown grapes for decades, towns whose names he could recite the way other people recite family birthdays. The scale of the plan was enormous, involving deep open pits stretching close to 1 kilometer in length, and a tailings dam large enough to hold toxic waste indefinitely. A permanent scar promised in exchange for temporary economic gain. Environmental groups warned it could devastate local wildlife, including populations of native lizards found nowhere else on the planet. The company countered with promises of jobs and economic growth running into the billions, the familiar trade-off offered in resource disputes the world over. He refused to sit this one out. He appeared in a short documentary opposing the project, joined the local community coalition fighting against it, and stood alongside longtime friends, including a respected local artist, at fundraising events to help finance the resistance. He was careful with his language throughout, telling one interviewer he was not against mining broadly, only against this particular mine, in this particular place, a distinction he clearly felt mattered even if his critics chose to ignore it. Prominent political and environmental voices stood with him, including a former prime minister and the country's own environmental watchdog agency, which cautioned that the project risked doing irreversible harm if it could not be managed safely. But the backlash was ugly. Government officials publicly dismissed his concerns, with one minister comparing the objection to complaining about a blemish on an otherwise beautiful landscape, and online critics mocked him as an out-of-touch wealthy celebrity worrying about the well-being of frogs rather than the livelihoods of working people. Worse, some supporters of the mining project sent him threats serious enough to warrant police involvement, a level of hostility that seemed wildly disproportionate to a farmer defending his own valley. In one recorded moment from that period, visibly shaken and speaking with none of his usual playful detachment, He admitted that the sheer hostility directed at him personally was something he had not been prepared for, that he had been genuinely taken aback by how toxic the response had become. Even so, he kept speaking out, insisting the project needed to be stopped before it caused permanent damage to a place that could never be restored once it was gone. To understand why a man in his late 70s, recently cancer-free, would willingly absorb that kind of abuse over a stretch of hillside most tourists would never even notice, you have to understand what that land actually meant to him, beneath all the public appearances and the film credits and the decades of fame. For Sam Neill, those hills were not a backdrop. His family's roots in central Otago stretched back more than a century and a half, long before he ever stood in front of a camera, long before the region had any connection to film or celebrity at all. For roughly 30 years, he had grown Pinot Noir and Riesling grapes on that land under his own wine label, joking modestly that his only real ambition was to make something his friends would actually enjoy drinking, and that since his friends would drink almost anything put in front of them, the bar had never been particularly high. He filled his farm with animals named after celebrities he admired, a running joke that delighted fans online for years, chickens and ducks and cows carrying the names of actresses and pop stars, a small private theater of affection hidden away from the cameras that usually followed him. He shared glimpses of that rural life constantly, half self-deprecating, half genuinely proud, cooking on camera during lockdowns and joking that it was rather like watching a glamorous celebrity chef, minus any of the glamour. He said many times that he had friends who lived the full, glittering life of movie stardom, private jets and bodyguards and constant recognition, and that he would never trade his own life for theirs. He could walk into his small local town, sit down for a coffee, and be left completely alone, unbothered by the fame that followed him everywhere else in the world. No security detail, no entourage, no performance required. He called that ordinary freedom priceless, and by every account he meant it with his whole heart, treating it as the one part of his life that fame had never managed to touch or distort. So when strangers began threatening him over a mining dispute tied to that very land, they were not simply attacking a public figure with an opinion they disagreed with. They were threatening the one place where he felt most fully like himself, the one corner of the world where the actor and the ordinary man were finally the same person. And yet, no matter how much that land meant to him privately, the world would always know him first for something else entirely, something that happened on a screen rather than in a vineyard. The character that introduced Sam Neill to the widest possible audience arrived in the summer of 1993, when he stepped into the role of paleontologist Alan Grant in Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park. His performance carried a quiet, steady authority, delivering warnings about prehistoric creatures with a calm that made the danger feel even more real, the stillness of a man who understood exactly how much trouble everyone around him was in without needing to raise his voice to prove it. What elevated the role beyond a simple action performance was the subtle emotional arc underneath it. A man initially uneasy around children who slowly, believably, becomes their protector over the course of a single terrifying day, all without a single moment of exaggerated sentimentality or a manufactured speech to underline the change. He returned to the character twice more, in a sequel nearly a decade later, and again in a modern revival of the franchise decades after the original film, joking that by the time of the third outing, he had finally learned how to convincingly play an action hero, gnarled and weathered in exactly the right way. That understated style was intentional, and he spoke about it often. He believed that the best screen acting hints at something happening beneath the surface, rather than announcing it outright, that a character should feel like a person with an entire private history the audience is only glimpsing a sliver of. That philosophy defined nearly everything he did on camera across 5 decades of work. A shift in the eyes, a pause held a beat too long, warmth turning to menace without ever raising his voice. It was acting so restrained that audiences frequently forgot they were watching a performance at all, which is precisely what made it so effective and so difficult for other actors to imitate. Remarkably, in that very same year his most famous film made him internationally recognizable overnight. He planted his very first vines back home in New Zealand, deliberately choosing to put down literal roots in the ground at the exact moment global fame was being offered to him on a plate. It was as if some part of him already understood, even then, that stardom would never be the piece of his life that mattered most, and that he would need somewhere real to return to once the cameras stopped rolling. To understand where that instinct came from, that deep suspicion of fame for its own sake, you have to go back much further, to a nervous, displaced child stepping off a boat into a country that was not yet home, carrying nothing familiar with him except his family. He was not born Sam. He entered the world as Nigel Neill in 1947 in Northern Ireland, the son of a military family whose life had already been shaped by upheaval and relocation. When his father left the army and decided to bring the family home, they sailed across the world to New Zealand, and young Nigel arrived as a complete outsider at the age of 7, unable to recognize a single face or landmark in his new surroundings. He was later sent to boarding school in Christchurch, a small boy with an unfamiliar accent among children who had never left the country, an outsider in nearly every sense a child can experience that word. He later explained, with characteristic bluntness, that arriving at school with a posh-sounding name and accent was practically an invitation for trouble. So he adopted the simpler, more approachable name that the world would come to know him by for the rest of his life. It was an early, instinctive lesson in blending in softening the parts of himself that made him stand out from the crowd, and that quiet watchfulness, that habit of observing before revealing himself, never fully left him, on screen or off it. He studied law at university before drifting toward the drama club and eventually abandoning academics altogether, a decision that must have seemed reckless to nearly everyone around him at the time. Without any formal acting training, he landed his first significant film role in the late 1970s, and an Australian producer soon brought him across the Tasman Sea for an award-winning drama that established him as a serious talent worth watching. His first real brush with international recognition, oddly enough, came from playing the adult son of the devil in a horror sequel, a role far removed from the thoughtful, restrained performances that would later define his career, but one that nonetheless opened doors across the industry and put his name in front of casting directors who might never otherwise have noticed him. From there, his range became almost impossible to summarize neatly. He acted opposite some of the most respected performers of his generation, appearing twice alongside one of the most celebrated actresses of the era. He played a Soviet submarine commander dreaming of an American life in a tense Cold War thriller, bringing unexpected warmth to a role that could easily have been reduced to a stereotype. He formed a lasting real-life friendship with a then largely unknown teenage actress after starring alongside her in a tense ocean survival film, a friendship that endured long after both of their careers had grown far beyond that small, claustrophobic production. He was reportedly even considered at one point as a potential successor to a legendary spy film franchise before the role went elsewhere, a near miss that fans of his work have speculated about for decades. He lost a finger on camera in a period drama that earned him some of the finest reviews of his career, lost his grip on sanity in a science fiction horror film that has since become something of a cult classic, and later chilled audiences as a menacing detective in an acclaimed crime drama series set in early 20th century England. He built an entire career on being quietly underestimated, on patient, understated endurance, on trusting that restraint would ultimately say more than volume ever could, which makes the final chapter of his life feel almost unbearably fitting and unbearably sad in equal measure. Perhaps the cruelest detail in this entire story is timing. The final government decision on the central Otago gold mine, the very battle he had poured his renewed energy into once the cancer seemed defeated, was expected in the closing months of 2026. He did not live long enough to hear the outcome. He had beaten a rare and aggressive cancer that had once looked likely to kill him, celebrated the people he admired at award ceremonies, accepted a nomination for work he was proud of, harvested a modest crop of olives from his own land with his own hands, and then, suddenly, without warning, he was gone, with the fate of the hills he had fought so hard for still hanging entirely in the balance. There is something almost unbearable about a man surviving the war everyone expected to end his story, only to be taken by something else entirely before the smaller, quieter battle he cared about most could be resolved one way or the other. Tributes poured in almost immediately from every corner of the industry and beyond, and together they paint a portrait of a man who was clearly as beloved off-screen as he was recognizable on it. Fellow actors described him as one of the greats, A mentor who had taken younger performers under his wing decades earlier and never let that generosity fade with time. Colleagues from his home country called him a national treasure and a genuine inspiration to everyone who had followed in his footsteps. Friends spoke of raising a glass of his own wine in his memory that very night, a small, fitting tribute to a man who had always preferred a shared bottle to a formal eulogy. Political leaders from both New Zealand and Australia issued statements of mourning, praising decades of work that had helped put their national film industries on the world stage, and the studio behind his most famous franchise released a brief tribute honoring the man who had spent decades running from fictional dinosaurs on their behalf, a small, almost affectionate nod to the role that had introduced him to millions of people who never once set foot in New Zealand or Australia. When you step back and look at the full shape of his life, the meaning of it becomes almost impossible to ignore. For more than 50 years, Sam Neill built a career playing the calm, decent, steady presence that everyone turns to when disaster strikes and the room around them is losing control, the scientist who keeps his head, the officer who keeps his composure, the detective who never raises his voice even when everyone around him is shouting. In his final year, away from any script or director, he quietly became that very man in real life, standing firm against pressure, defending land that mattered more to him than any film role ever could, and absorbing genuine hostility for the trouble, all without ever once abandoning the fight, simply because it had become uncomfortable or dangerous. The cancer that once seemed destined to define his final chapter did not get the last word, and in the end, neither did the mine, at least not yet. The hills he loved are still waiting for their answer, sitting exactly as they did the day he last walked among them. The fight he started continues without him, carried forward now by the community members and friends who stood beside him and who have made it clear they have no intention of stopping simply because their most famous advocate is gone. And for millions of people around the world who never met him, who knew him only through a flickering screen, he remains exactly what he always seemed to be in every role he ever played: steady, warm, quietly brave, endlessly watchable, and completely unforgettable. A man who spent his career playing heroes and somehow, in his final months, managed to become one.